We're here to talk about a healthy cardiac diet to prevent further or first cardiac events. Diet is really important. We tend to think that heart disease and the risk factors for heart disease are all going to be cured with medicine. And there's some powerful, important medicines, but lifestyle is the driving force that we can change, hopefully, to stop the progression of cardiovascular disease or prevent it in the first place. And diet is an important part of that lifestyle. And there's been a lot of confusion in the past few years, and some of the things that we've always said were true are being questioned now. And they're not just being questioned by crazy internet people, but also by trusted health professionals. And so the result is, as a consumer, you might just think, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to cut out all the saturated fat, or am I supposed to eat butter all day? And there's not a clear path of what you should do. And you'll hear about extreme diets, you know. And in the old days, there's still leftovers of 30 and 40 years ago, where we heard that a good cardiac diet was super low fat. You probably heard that, you know, and my parents' friends, you know, when their husbands had heart disease, they would put them on these super low-fat diets. Well, what we found out is when you did that, you ended up giving the person a lot more carbohydrate in their diet, and a lot of times that carbohydrate was in the form of sugars. And what we set up was an inflammatory process with all this carbohydrate. We set up insulin resistance and really created more problems. But we were following a really low-fat diet. And so now what we're trying to translate and get straight is we want a fairly low saturated fat diet, a certain type of fat, but not a low-fat diet. We want good oils, and we want avocados, and we want fatty fish, and we want nuts in the diet, okay? They're fine, and for years people have said, oh, I'm not going to eat nuts because they're high fat, but it's a good fat. And so what we're trying to get by now is, it's not an extremely low-fat diet. But what happens also is food manufacturers, they'll hear the background noise of what we're talking about as a healthy diet, and then they create a food with all these little bits and pieces of what they think you ought to have. So they'll put fiber in it. Who knows where the fiber came from? And they'll put, oh, I don't know, chia seeds in it. And then they'll put sugar in there because nobody told them they shouldn't use sugar. And you know what? In the meantime, you could have had a piece of fruit and some nuts, and you would have had a much better part of your diet. So one of the things I think we want to really celebrate is eating less processed food and more of what used to be the pyramid, but now is the plate, where we encourage lots of fruits and vegetables, some whole grains, not lots, lean meats, nuts, some dairy, some fats, you know, a variety of foods, but not so processed. And that's what we're looking at. You've probably heard about the Mediterranean diet. And I hear about it all the time, and I still think, yeah, but exactly what is the Mediterranean diet? Because if you think about the Mediterranean countries, you've got Spain and Italy and Greece, and you've got the North African countries. There's a lot of different kinds of cultural foods in that. But what we see is the people who have a lot of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, not a lot of red meat, not a lot of high-fat dairy, they have good health outcomes. And some of the longest living people in the world live in that region. And so, you know, for years you might have heard, oh, you should use olive oil, as if olive oil itself would just save you. But it's an important component. It's a good fat. You might have heard the part going back 15 years, red wine, Mediterranean diet, red wine. Well, that's fine unless wine upsets your stomach and gives you gastritis. Then maybe it's not what you need. You know, so everybody wants to pick apart the Mediterranean diet, but in fact, it's not a lot of red meat. It's fish twice a week, and that's what the dietary guidelines suggest. And if we look at something called the DASH diet, that supports the same thing. The DASH diet is something that says dietary approaches to stop hypertension. It's been tested and researched and shown to be a powerful diet. It again emphasizes more fruits and vegetables than you usually eat, I'm sure. Some whole grains, some dairy, not a lot of meat, nuts in there, you know. It's the same thing we're hearing again and again. So that's what I want to get across to this audience, is that we don't have to have a lot of fancy made for cardiac foods, you know. If you can find a way to include more vegetables in your diet. You know, traditionally the American diet in a dinner plate is brown and white. It's the meat and starch, right? Steak and potatoes, whatever. So what we're talking about now is we have this little piece of meat, fish, poultry, beans, eggs, little bit of a starchy food, potatoes, rice, pasta, and a lot of vegetables, lots of color. Okay, and maybe you're not used to cooking vegetables, and maybe you're tired of cooking. You know, you cooked and raised 10 kids and you've had it. You're not cooking anymore. So you're going out to fast casual restaurants, and you know where to get the Wednesday early dinner for cheap. But those meals are really not in your best efforts, because they're going to be high in sodium and they're going to be probably bigger portions than you need. And one of the things contributing to all of these risk factors for heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, is if we gain a lot of weight, all of those get worse. And when we eat these large restaurant portions, we're getting a lot more calories than we need. You can look up the calorie content of a lot of entrees in these restaurants, and it's like 800 or 900 calories. And once you get into your 60s, you probably only need 1,300 or 1,400 calories a day. You know, maybe 1,500 or 1,600 if you're a man, but you know, not so much when you're a woman. And here you're having one meal with all of these calories. It's real hard to get a handle on that. So what I want to talk about is less processed food, more fruits and vegetables. And people are like, well, I thought I shouldn't have fruit because it's sugary and it's sweet. Along with the carbohydrate and fruit, you get powerful antioxidants. You get lots of nutrients. You get good fiber. And look, it tastes good. Where do you go wrong? You know, people say, well, you know, I heard grapes are too sweet. Well, you're not going to eat a pound of grapes, hopefully. You know, you're going to take a handful, 15 or 20 grapes. So we're looking at modest portions of a variety of food. And that's where we're going with this. There's lots of shortcuts that aren't really going to reduce the quality of the food. Let's look at vegetables. If you go buy a fresh vegetable, you have to wash it and you have to chop it and you have to get it ready and then cook it. You can buy bags, individual bags of frozen vegetables, and you just have to toss them in the microwave and they're cooked, okay? I would prefer if they weren't vegetables that have cheese sauces and butter sauces on them, and then you can put your own seasonings on them. But that saves on the work, and you can get a nice little piece of fish and you can just microwave it, or you can cook it in 5 minutes on top of the stove. Easy stuff. Now, a lot of people, when they think dairy, their primary source is cheese. But the cheese has a lot of fat and a lot of sodium. And for a lot of us that are dealing with cardiovascular risk factors, we shouldn't be getting a whole lot of sodium. And so cheese is one of the major sources of sodium in the American diet. So I usually tell people, cheese, make it great cheese, maybe expensive cheese so you don't overeat it, and have it as a special thing, not as an all-the-time food. You know, everybody's slapping a slice of that American cheese, whatever that stuff is, on sandwiches. And then when they're told they have heart disease, they'll say, well, I'll take the ham off that sandwich and keep the cheese. And I'm like, no, you do a lot better to take the cheese off the sandwich and keep the ham, okay? Even though that's salty too, but it's leaner. So cheese is okay, but special times, but not all the time, okay? And if you do want to go with a cheese, the cheese with the lowest sodium content is Swiss cheese. It has about 1/3 of the sodium of the other cheeses. So if you have to go there. Yeah. The other thing that I think can be real helpful if you're cutting back on the portions in your diet, you're still trying to get good protein, is trying some of the Greek yogurts. Greek yogurt is a lot like the regular yogurt, but it's concentrated. And it has 2 to 3 times more protein per serving than a regular yogurt. So you can take a little half-cup portion and get as much protein as 1 or 2 eggs. Pretty good deal, low calorie. You can get yogurts in low fat, no fat. I would watch out for the full fat because the calorie level goes way up. And then watch out because some of those yogurts are so loaded with sugar. You know, they're fruit flavored and there's some people who feel like sugar is probably our next target for a heart healthy diet, to try to get rid of the extra sugar. Sugar doesn't bring any nutrients in. It ups the calories, it ups the carbohydrate content, makes the liver work differently, which upsets some of our fats, our triglycerides and our cholesterols. So, you know, I think that's where you're going to see more emphasis, less on the fats than we had in the past and more on cutting back on the sugar. And that's an interesting thing because the American Heart Association, starting 5 years ago, has had a sugar restriction that they talk about. You know, we think people should not have more than 6 teaspoons of added sugar in a day. And you're like, what does the Heart Association care about sugar? Why aren't they worried about fat? But it's because Americans have so much sugar in their diet, and we really think that contributes to some of the risk factors for heart disease. So if you are using sugar substitutes, I think it's worth trying to get used to less sweetness. Because there's people who just replace 5 or 6 regular sodas a day with 5 or 6 diet sodas a day. And you're dealing with a lot of chemicals coming into your system. I mean, let's think water there. Americans consume too much salt, sodium chloride, and that this contributes to hypertension, high blood pressure, and that we need to decrease the amount of sodium in our diets through decreasing the added salt. And especially, you know, if you have high blood pressure or fluid issues or a weak heart, you don't want to be having a lot of salty foods because your body's going to hold more fluids to try to dilute that. Heart has to work harder. The blood pressure is going to be higher. So again, this would push us towards less processed foods where if there's any salt, we've added it. It's not hidden in the food. From years ago, doctors would sometimes say, you can salt your food before you cook it, but not at the table, which led people to think that cooking changed the salt. This is not true. So whether you add the salt before you cook it or later, it still will affect you. So be careful at both ends of the cooking and at the table. And enjoy those other flavors that can perk up your food, like garlic and lemon juice and vinegar and onions and all those other things. Bon appetit!